In this lecture, we will take a look at a sample servlet. So what this sample servlet does is it returns a response which is an HTML file, and in the response we are simply sending a web page where the title is servlet sample, the name of the sample servlet, and we are just printing the context path of the servlet. So this is the code for the sample servlet. So these are the import statements wherein we are importing all the classes that are required for our servlet. Then we start with a class. So this is our sample servlet class. And as we saw that a servlet has to extend either a generic servlet class or the HTTP servlet. So that is why here we are extending HTTP servlet. Then we are overriding the doGet method. So in this case, as you can see, we are overriding the doGet method which starts here, and this is the end of the doGet method. In this doGet method, which is the service method, there are two arguments. One argument is the HTTP servlet request and other is HTTP servlet response. So as we had seen in the life cycle of servlet, in the step 5, request and response objects are created by the server, and those are passed to the service method. So this is that service method, and this method, the doGet method, throws servlet exception and IO exception. Next, inside this doGet method, we are manipulating the response object so that we can set the response. So here we are calling methods of the response like set content type, then get writer, so that we can write to the response. And here inside the out.println lines, we are simply writing to our response. So we are writing to this object, and this is the response that we are going to return to our client. Next, we are just overriding this getServletInfo method, which returns a string, which is just a short description of the servlet. Now we will take a look at all of the code block by block. So these are the import statements. Now the entire servlet API is contained within two packages. So these are the two packages, javax.servlet and javax.servlet.http. So like here you can see javax.servlet contains the servlet exception class. So servlet exception class is the class that we had thrown using from the service method. So this is the servlet exception. Similarly, we are importing java.io because we are also throwing IO exception from the doGet method. So IO exception might occur because we are writing to the response object. So the response object returns a writer object, print writer object, which we saw here. So this out is the print writer object that we are returning when we call the get writer method of the response. And because we are writing the output, so this HTML file is being written to the print writer object. That is why there might be an IO exception while writing to this object. So that is why we are using the IO exception, print writer, and servlet exception. Then we will also need the HTTP servlet class because we are using the HTTP servlet to extend our sample servlet. So as you can see here, we are extending the HTTP servlet. And we also import HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response because these two are the types of our request and response objects. So these three classes are contained in the javax.servlet.http package, and the servlet exception is contained in javax.servlet package. While declaring the sample servlet class, it is a public class which extends HTTP servlet. So HTTP servlet is a class which contains methods which are specific to HTTP protocol. It is derived from the interface servlet. Same goes with the generic servlet class. Generic servlet class is derived or implemented from the interface servlet, and it is useful for building servlets for protocols other than HTTP like FTP, Post Office Protocol, Telnet, etc. In the class definition, we will be defining a service method. So because we will be using a GET request, we will be overriding the toGet method. So the signature for doGet method is protected void doGet, and the arguments are a request object and a response object. So the request object is of the type HTTP servlet request, and the response object is of the type HTTP servlet response. Now, the servlet exception or the unavailable exception indicates that the servlet is unavailable, and IO exception may occur because we are working with the network request and response, and we are writing to the response which is using a print writer object. Now, first we'll have to set the content type of the response. So because we will be sending an HTML response, so that is why here we specify text/HTML. So text/HTML, so this text is the category and HTML is the subcategory, and the character set is UTF-8. There are different types, subtypes in text as well. So if you write text/plain, then the response that we are writing in the response object, that will be treated as plain text, not HTML. Then we'll have to get a handle to write to the response. So we can obtain that using the response.getWriter method. So this getWriter method of HTTP servlet response will return a print writer object which we are naming out, and we will be using this object to write to the response. Now here we are using try with resources, so that is why we are creating this object inside the try block, inside the try statement. But if you feel, you can also create the print writer object here and then use a normal try, catch and finally block to close this resource. Next, in the out is the print writer object, and we can use print or println methods. So using the println method here, we are writing the HTML response. So here, as you can see, we are just starting with the HTML tag and then followed by the head tag, then the title tag. Then in the body, we are just printing a line which is in header 1, which says servlet sample servlet at, and it is printing the context path. So request.getContextPath will print the context path of our application. So it is nothing but the URL using which the client will be accessing our servlet, and then we close the body and we close the HTML. So the response will now contain all the text that we have written here using the out.println, and so this is what our response will look like. This is the HTML file that is going to be sent to the client. We will now see how to execute a simple servlet in Netbeans. As we had seen earlier, the Java files will be in the source packages folder, whereas the HTML and JSP files will reside in the web pages folder. Now, since we are creating the servlet file, which is a Java class, we will be creating it in the source packages. So right click on source packages, select new and select servlet. Enter the class name and the package name here and click on next. On click of next, it will ask you to add information to deployment descriptor, which is the web.xml file. So when you check this checkbox, it will add the following information, that is the class name, that is unit 1 my sample servlet. It will add this class name, the servlet name, so my sample servlet is the name of our servlet, and the URL pattern, which is by default the name of the servlet. So we can have multiple URL patterns for the same servlet, so they can be appended here in this list. So all this information, the mapping will be added to the deployment descriptor, that is the web.xml file. On click of finish, the servlet will be created. So this servlet, my sample servlet.java, this file is something as shown. So here we can see that a class my sample servlet has been created, which extends HTTP servlet as we have seen in the sample servlet. It contains a method which is protected void process request. This is very similar to the signature of doGet. As you can see here, we have the request and response as arguments, and it throws servlet exception and IO exception. So basically Netbeans creates this method process request, and it is just delegating the calls from doGet and doPost. So here in this code, as you can see, we have both the methods, that is doGet and doPost, along with the getServletInfo method. From the doGet and the doPost method, so these two methods are just delegating calls to the process request method, and they are just forwarding the request and response. So in our code, in the sample servlet code that we had seen that we are working with the doGet method. So instead, what we can do is we are just renaming the process request method as doGet, and we are deleting the doGet and doPost methods that were created by Netbeans. So this is the same sample servlet that we had seen earlier, and we are just printing the context path taken from the request object. Now if we try to run this code by right clicking in it, so since we are not passing any arguments, we will just run it as it is. The output of the servlet will be displayed in a browser. So the default browser for my application is Google Chrome. That is why the HTML file that was sent by the server is being displayed in this browser. Now in the address bar, if you notice, the URL says localhost, which is the current machine, port 80, and project 1 is the web application context. My sample servlet is the URL pattern that we had entered when we were creating our servlet. In the body of our web page, we can see that we are printing the line which was entered in the header 1, which says servlet my sample servlet at the context path. So this project 1 is the context path. And here, as you can see, the title is servlet my sample servlet. So this is the same HTML file that we had written in the out.println statements. Now, how does the server know which file to map to which URL pattern? So that is entered in the deployment descriptor. The deployment descriptor can be found in the web.inf folder of the web pages. So web.xml, this file is the deployment descriptor. So here in the deployment descriptor, which starts with the web app tag, so the version is mentioned here, the namespace is mentioned here, and inside the web app tag, we have a servlet tag which contains the servlet name, that is my sample servlet, and it maps the servlet name to the servlet class. So this is the servlet class. This is the package name unit 1, and my sample servlet is the Java file name. Next, there is a mapping of the servlet name to the URL pattern. So in this servlet mapping, as we can see, we have the my sample servlet URL pattern. So the URL pattern, there can be multiple URL patterns, or we can also change the URL pattern from here. Then there is a session config tag, which contains some configuration parameters about the session, like the session timeout. So by default, the session timeout is 30 minutes.